Hello, all. And continuing with Aristotle, I now want to look over our shoulder, if you will, to see where we have been in anticipation to where we are going with regards to Aristotle and his metaphysical system here. So, Aristotle so far has gone from explaining change, or at least the processes of change, and it is a fourfold factoring. And so, it is not simply just matter or material, what objects are made of, or its efficiency, that is, with regards to forces being acted upon those objects that causes change. We then have the formal cause, which is the essential nature of said object, and we brushed up then on the final cause, which is the purposing of such changes. This metaphysical scheme, which is, the causes of change in the world, is also extended by Aristotle to his cosmology, as we've discussed. So the changes on the earth is accounted for, and the planets or the fixed stars outside of the universe being a part of its own axis that gives forth this concept of locomotion or endless motion of a spatial type that is circular in its rotation. And what is that causal explanation? Now, of course, which was common for the Greeks, you have the material nature, the elements, the basic stuff that always was or is. And then we have the ether and the perimeter of things and those planets themselves. The efficient cause, the movement of the fixed stars, produces change then in the ether that maintains rotation of the fixed beings. And this then is going to contribute to how changes are going to occur for the earth. There's different cycles in this case, and although Aristotle doesn't explicitly talk about this himself, other people have since, prescribed this to how being, of course, with the study of astrology. So we have these different conditions that are developed on the Earth's surface that are, given to us efficiently by the relationship of the fixed stars to the Earth being the center of the universe in this case. So formal cause then, in the nature of things, including the nature of the fixed stars who are meant to spin and spinning around, isn't simply just potential, but what actually maintains how the fixed stars actualize that motion of the cosmos, what maintains such an efficient movement of the universe. Beyond this, giving consistent actuality of rotation and movement within the stars of the universe, and beyond, it has to have something that is unmoving, that yearns to give out this wanting of this circular motion that doesn't have any sort of linear start point. It continues to go on, giving movement to these things. The unmoved is unmoving, but gives movement to what moves. It, which doesn't change, but is the ultimate cause of all change, with its influence on the fixed stars, giving away to the efficiency of causes in our universe. Aristotle, essentially, in his cosmology, sees the Earth as the model for, of course, in his geocentric model, it's the center point, and then we see outwardly the rotation of the planets around it to then be influenced by the fixed stars beyond that spinning in their own way. And beyond that, then, is something that is unmoving, which gives necessary forces that gives us change to those outer fixed stars that will then influence and change to the center being, which is the Earth itself. So that is a rough upshot of his metaphysical scheme, how changes occur on Earth, and how those changes that occur on Earth are also have a causal sense towards his cosmology as well, with the likes of the fixed stars, their movement, and something has to contribute to why they are moving in such a way, how they are able to rotate on their own axis, and that would be with the unmoved mover, which gives us change. And so by the time you get to the end of book 12 of the Metaphysics, he continues to flesh out and look at this picture, and actually there has been literary criticism to come out of book 12. Aristotle, as we pointed out with the Metaphysics, this was loose leafed notes largely that were comprised together by people who weren't Aristotle, the heirs to his work, if you will. And so there has been many literary claims to come out to say that perhaps this isn't nearly as authentic, or the way it's composed of isn't authentic to perhaps how Aristotle would have wanted to present it. Again, these were, largely loose lectures put together in a fashion or that was somewhat of a mishmash of all of these different concepts, and they didn't neatly fit into some of the categories for other things such as ethics or politics, whatever that case may be. And so, they comprise them all together, and book 12 is one of the ones that people turn to ask whether or not this is what Aristotle intended by having it composed in such a way. So this will be our starting point, really, from how Aristotle was going to draw from this unmoved mover towards his concept of God. This is a suggestion that he is pure actuality. We know potentials, of course, in the Aristotelian language, and actuality. And so we can pick up on this for Aristotle, that all change is the actualization of a potential. I'm potentially in one point over here and actualize when I move to another point over here. I have the potential to put my hand over the webcam, and now I actualize it as such. And so if Aristotle is saying God is pure actuality, then it is to say that there is no unactualized potential. There is no change really possible within God. The unmoved or the unchanging is the ultimate source of change, however. So why would Aristotle say this, though? Why would he give such a static or bounding account, if you will, of his unmoved mover here? And this is to say, on one hand, being that God is the good, and with that, cannot have a necessity to change. If he is perfection, why would he change? Why would he have a potential with him to actualize anything if he is perfection? Aristotle wants us to show that the everlasting, the timeless, just as discussed with locomotion with its circular-like character that doesn't have a start or end point, that gives the fixed stars its character, something unchanging in its nature, and an unchanging nature would then, in this case, be either nothing, there's no potential to it because it is nothing, quite literally, with no potential, or it is the purest form of actualization, with no unactualized potential, giving meaning to the no change being possible here with the unmoved mover. He's either going to be nothing or he is perfection, and that is the route that Aristotle is going to choose here. Now, much like, of course, his teacher, Plato, of course, say there are transcendent forms. These are eternal forms, and in this form, there is, of course, the form of the good, and that is an unchanging notion. And the same could be said with his student Aristotle here, with regards to being beyond all process of change and having something eternal as well, and having something unchanging. Aristotle is either left with nothing or perfect, as I said before, and clearly shows the unmoved as something that is perfect. Interestingly, though, we do see in other literature for Aristotle, and of course we're going beyond the metaphysics here, where he does, in fact, talk about things like the rational soul, much like the predecessor Anaxagoras. But it isn't clear necessarily if he sees this as a world soul in the Platonic case, in the artificer case, that's transcendent, or simply his unmoved mover itself. However, in traditional interpretations, we clearly see that Aristotle is largely translated, or going to be translated going forward, to the more theistic and deistic interpretations. But I do think it is an interesting aside here to say that it isn't necessarily, clear that he gives this same account for the rational soul as what he gives his account for the unmoved mover. Perhaps there is something more at play here, but again, history says that there is a tradition to just simply intertwine them both and not think too much about it. But nonetheless, it isn't necessarily clear from just Aristotle's account alone here. Now, with regards to the characteristics of God himself for Aristotle, we can see that this God is going to turn out to be much different, especially going forward past Aristotle, and of course in the Middle Ages, where this God for Aristotle isn't really in the ways of creation, especially divine creation out of nothing in the Christian sense. The act of creation, bringing into existence, creating out of nothing things that are and give existence to. This, of course, is not the Aristotelian account here. And as seen in chapter 7, he is not of efficient cause. One does not give power or force and isn't the moving efficiency. And he's very clear about the differences between efficiency and final cause here. Final cause doesn't have a push or a sort of forceful creation to bring about beings. And so this isn't necessarily because the materials of the cosmos always existed. The elements always were there for the Greeks. Just as the same with the material elements on the earth, they always existed and were always here. The same could be said about his cosmological structure, what is everlasting, which is locomotion, which always rotated, was always here, was always fixed within the stars and how they moved around the universe. The God then is the one who continues motion, the everlasting locomotion of this universe. For the Greeks, and this is an important aside here perhaps to consider, motion isn't really a natural concept. There isn't, of course, modern physics yet. And so there is, a thinking here with the regards to motion, that something is actually brought forth upon this thing. It requires something to be given upon to make way for change. So there is the necessity, really, in order for motion to really take place, it's that something has to be given upon it. It isn't just something spontaneous, if you will. And in order to make this system really work, there has to be a being then that must maintain this everlasting necessity to bring forth everlasting motion. However, this cannot simply be efficiencies, as we've talked about, because force must be exerted by doing so in order to give a process of change, and not exerting to participate in it. And so if there is to be no change, then no force is to be, and with that, no efficient cause. So then how would we explain changes then? Then this is to turn to God and say that God is the final cause and not efficient, because the nature of the unmoved mover is filled with wonder. He's wonderful, quite literally. And so the things that are moved by its wonder, you wander towards it to be like it. And he uses the expression interchangeably with love as what is the mover, and a desire to be like what is wonderful. And so matter for Aristotle is alive then. It participates in the fixation to yearn and to love and to have wonder put forth. Now, Aristotle is unclear, though, if he thinks that these stars are actually conscious living things that are moving, of course. Way these fixed stars are actually somehow consciously doing this, consciously participating. Perhaps it could be said that it is an unconscious thing, just as a similar way to how, there's no abstract rule book, if you will, for something like a seed, knowing to sprout out. And perhaps this could be an analogy to the stars with his cosmology. They simply already know to rotate, know to have a locomotion, and yearn towards moving in this circular direction. It's somewhat innate, if you will. There was no real learning capacity for it, if you will. Then we can turn to our thinking. If this divine being is pure actuality and that doesn't have to, participate to, put force onto things, then how do we characterize its actuality? Aristotle describes thinking of one's own thinking, or to say to muse or to ponder, to have a sort of self-conscious experience as we do and we think and meditate about something. And so if this unmoved mover was getting input from outside, if it was, taking in stimulus, if you will, from outside of its own thinking, moving, it would be moved towards that stimulus. It would be moved towards outside thinking or forces being placed upon the unmoved mover, and that can't happen. He cannot be moved by such things, by the externals, and since he is pure actualization, there can be no input from the outside, because he wouldn't know the stimulus to change his thoughts. If he had something outside of his knowledge, outside of his own thoughts, then that would be an input to put in to cause him to change. It then wouldn't be a self-reflection then. If he had brand new ideas then, or exerting an activity that didn't exist before, that, suddenly comes into being, then that is an unactualized potential involved. The only mental the unmover can have then is self-conscious and reflection of his own thoughts that he already had, that has already been. A being then that is perfectly good has to be so because the good is the actualization of potential, such as the case with a dog who, the best possible dog he could be, a good dog, it is the virtue of the type of dog that he was given upon when he was given creation. And so the same could be said for you to be good is to actualize your roles in life, of being the best shape of the being in those roles, for you to be a full fleshed out flourishing human, if you will, to kind of brush up on his ethics somewhat in anticipation of that. For pure actuality then, he has to be of pure goodness. He cannot have any privation or lacking of anything. He is the form of the goodness. And so this is what we would really actually consider someone in Aristotle's framework here, an original attempt at a natural theology where he's, based off of all of these inferences from the ecology of the earth, the way things change, what they're made of, how those processes of change come about. And you've seen now he's built from that. He continues to go up, then he gets to cosmology, and then he has an explanation for a final cause, an unmoved mover that causes all change in the world. And so you could see that this is an anticipation for natural theology, because he uses the inferences of the state of nature around him, how things change, and builds out of that a system for us that, eventually goes to what the final cause is that causes change. And this basic framework that Aristotle has gifted us here is going to have huge ramifications, especially for traditions like theology, with the likes of Thomas Aquinas, and really all of the other Abrahamic religions that are going to get a hold of this model. and use this Aristotelian scheme to then eventually suit the idea of creation and having an almighty God who actually does delve into efficient causes. But of course, that comes much later. And so, with that, I think I've explained and given an account here for Aristotle's final piece, really, of his metaphysical system for how change is brought about with the unmoved mover, and with that, his own characteristics of God and this unmoved mover, who and its capacity and characteristics within how its role in the universe is to be taken with the Aristotelian account here, and the characteristics of his God and cosmology and how that plays into his philosophy. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and now we will really delve into epistemology and logic for Aristotle in the next video. And I hope you guys stay tuned and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for that coming up.